All right, here we are. I'm with Paul for our preliminary response or review of Dr. Zach Hancock's review of this book right here, Genetic Entropy by Dr. John Sanford. And so Zach put out a review criticizing Dr. John Sanford's book, Genetic Entropy. As our audience knows, we at Standing for Truth, we focus heavily on the topic of genetic entropy. So Paul and I, we want to provide you a preliminary response to some of Zach's points. We have watched it, and I think we got some good stuff to convey today. So Paul, firstly, thanks for being here, brother. Always a pleasure and always a privilege. How you doing? And kick us off with maybe a point that Zach made in his response that we can kind of go back and forth on a little bit.
Absolutely, Donnie. Thanks for having me for this very kind of short, informal talk where we're just kind of, this is just to get the ball rolling here, because neither of us are, PhD geneticists or anything, which Dr. John Sanford is, and Dr. Zach Hancock is as well. And so, this is one PhD geneticist to another, and we're kind of, I don't want to say on the sidelines, but, we're informed non-scientists, non-experts who we're both interested in this topic and have studied it extensively and have, put out things on this topic. And so that's the reason why we're talking about it. But ultimately, the very best person to respond to Dr. Zach Hancock about Dr. John Sanford would be Dr. John Sanford, or one of the other PhD geneticists like Dr. Rob Carter, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, just to name a couple, people, who are educationally speaking on the same level as Zach Hancock. And that's what I hope to see in the future. But, even if we don't see that, I think we can make some important observations about the types of statements that Zach Hancock has made. And I think you'll agree with me, Donnie, that the biggest thing that disappointed me about Zach's review is the degree to which he seems to have gone after the cheap shots, gone after the low-hanging fruit. He's been very derisive toward John Sanford in a way that I think is frankly just, it makes himself look bad that he's choosing to be this, I guess, just disrespectful towards John Sanford. Even if he disagrees with John Sanford, I don't feel like his demeanor that he took in that video review was appropriate, and it was not professional for him to take, and make it really a personal attack against John Sanford, in addition to a professional attack against him as a geneticist. So I guess my first response was, I just thought it was in poor taste the way that Zach chose to do it. It wasn't professional, and he extended no professional courtesy to John whatsoever. And then another thing that struck me was that, on the one hand, he attacks John's book for being, at a layperson's level, which it is, and nobody is trying to deny that. He wrote it as a way to introduce lay people to this concept and to the debate about genetic entropy, and to give us lay people a leg to stand on in this debate, and to get us, introduced into it. So it's not fair to look at that book as if it were, an academic research paper as opposed to a layperson's book, which in some areas it seems like that's what Zach was doing. And he never gives John any type of charitable benefit of the doubt when it comes to the wording of any of his statements in the book, And so I think that's part of the problem there, is that he's, reading the casual language of a lay level book as if it were the technical precisely worded language of a peer-reviewed academic paper. So some of his attacks just fall flat on that basis alone, because he'll home in on, a couple of words, like when John Sanford said correct distribution, okay, and then talking about the distribution of fitness effects, and then claiming, oh, well, by this, John Sanford obviously meant that this is literally the exactly correct distribution in every situation, and there's no room for any improvement on it, which that's just not what he meant at all in context. I've been debating this topic for many years now, and the pattern that you generally see, and Zach's review is no exception to this pattern, is that the evolutionist wants to get away from the big picture so they can draw your attention away into small counterexamples that aren't representative of the whole. They want to train themselves and you to deliberately miss the forest for the trees. So when Dr. John Sanford says, for example, that essentially all beneficial mutations will be effectively neutral or nearly neutral, then the evolutionist like Zach Hancock wants to jump on that and say, oh, but look at this paper where we observed a very highly beneficial mutation. And see, this proves John Sanford wrong. Well, no, it doesn't, because what John Sanford is talking about is the ultimate big picture of mutations in the long term and for large populations, or large scale view. So when you try to show, well, we have a paper where we observed a highly beneficial mutation, to act like that is a refutation of genetic entropy is just, I think, intellectually dishonest. And when I actually took the time to look to actually
I could say one thing to
yeah,
that,
go ahead, break in here.
because I think that's an excellent point there. And okay, I heard an echo, but it's gone. Dr. John Sanford has pointed out many times in both his lay level articles and his technical papers that natural selection may be able to amplify a really good beneficial mutation, and it can remove your worst mutations, your most detrimental mutations. But like you said, brother, and you nailed it, it's about net gain versus net loss. It's about the bigger picture. You're going to need not just one, not just two, not just 10 truly beneficial mutations. And we can argue all day if those so-called beneficial mutations are reductive on a genotypic level or if they're not reductive at all. It doesn't really matter, because you would need thousands of those types of beneficial mutations that Zach Hancock's talking about to counterbalance any of the damage that is taking place due to the influx of these low impact.
Exactly. Like, imagine you say, "Oh man, I'm gaining weight. I'm getting fat. I'm gaining weight." Right? Well, what does that claim mean when you break it down? It means you're claiming that you're eating more calories than you're burning. Right? That's the only way you could gain weight. So, on the other way, like when you bring that to the table, genetically speaking, if you claim and here's where the evolutionists are kind of between a rock and a hard place, and depending on who you ask, some of them are going to say fitness is on the increase, and others are going to say no, fitness is at an equilibrium. But either way, if you're saying that fitness is on the increase, then you're saying that the overall effect, the cumulative effect, is such that the beneficial mutations are outweighing the deleterious ones on the whole. Or if you're saying that fitness is perfectly stable, then you're saying essentially that the net effect of mutations is somehow balanced on a knife edge, and the deleterious is exactly counterbalancing the beneficial. And the sheer unlikeliness of this scenario becomes clear when you look at an overall distribution of fitness effects, such as what was was produced by Dr. John Sanford in his book. And also, let me add, actually, I'll share my screen to show this image. Let's see. And I just want to show, let's see, a tab. Sorry. This is what I want to show. Share. So if you look here, this isn't from the book Genetic Entropy, but this is from the Baziner and Sanford peer-reviewed technical article on Fisher's theorem.
Right.
And here's where he shows, basically the correct distribution of fitness effects for mutations. The one that they're arguing for is the darker one in the middle here, not this bigger one. We'll get back to this in a minute. But what they're saying is that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious and very small in effect, because you see the center there is 0 fitness effect, which would be strictly neutral. And technically we're saying that there are none of those, but this line approaches that line. So the majority, if you do, like, in calculus, you take the, what is it called? The integral, like the area underneath this curve, the majority of the fitness effects are very small and deleterious. Now, they do say right here in the paper, note that beneficial mutations are present in the gamma distribution, but are too unlikely to appear on this plot. So they're not claiming that there are no beneficial mutations at all. This is the claim, this is the straw man that you oftentimes get, is that, oh, well, they're saying there are no beneficial mutations when I can prove from X, Y, or Z paper that there are beneficial mutations. Well, that's not their claim. That's a straw man. They say that there are beneficial mutations, but they're just so the prevalence of them compared to deleterious is so small that it's hard to even measure or plot that correctly. So in here, they don't even attempt to plot it. But the point, let me stop that sharing here for a second. The point I'm getting at there is that this view of mutations just doesn't jive with this idea that fitness can be either perfectly stable or that it could even be increasing. So this is why you don't find evolutionists who are willing to, it's very rare that they are willing to even attempt to produce a plot like this, because just by plotting it, you're kind of showing people how unrealistic evolution is. So, you will see, and this is something that Zach Hancock frequently appeals to, you will see, studies and mutation accumulation experiments where they plot the effects that they witnessed in their experiment. And that's good. And even when you look at those, you will see that they are mostly deleterious, right? But in individual experiments, you can occasionally run across really highly beneficial things that happen in the narrowly defined fitness context of that experiment, right? So the reason why it's so important to go to the overall model view as opposed to the results of any one experiment is because when you look at the overall big picture, that's what we're trying to do. Then you see how much more likely mutations are to be damaging than helpful. And this is why, for example, Dillon and Cooper in their peer-reviewed article, The Fitness Effects of Spontaneous Mutations Nearly Unseen by Selection in a Bacterium with Multiple Chromosomes. That's the name of their paper. So very elegant title there. But they write, although a few select studies have claimed that a substantial fraction of spontaneous mutations are beneficial under certain conditions, evidence from diverse sources strongly suggests that the effect of most mutations is to reduce fitness. Now, that's something that they don't want to deal with, but that's what they have to deal with. That is the heart and the crux of genetic entropy. It's that most mutations are very small and at the same time, most mutations are deleterious. And when you put those two things together, you realize that we have a problem, because natural selection is very poor at getting rid of those very, very small mutations. So, unfortunately, what Zach has done is to try to detract attention away from those facts and into these other things. And one of the things he attempts to appeal to is something that John Sanford talks about in his book, which is the traditional um, quote unquote textbook style mathematical population genetics equations. And what I'm going to refer to specifically is I'll give you the timestamp is 2254, where in this review, Hancock starts to give us some of this textbook math that supposedly proves John Sanford is wrong. And I thought it was very interesting and rich how he started out by saying, I'm going to explain how not only are the preponderance of deleterious mutations not a problem for evolution, but that it is a prediction of evolutionary theory. He goes so far as to say that. Now, that's pretty ironic and funny because uh, I'm not sure that he's even aware of this paper. I'm not sure, but Baziner and Sanford, the paper that I just showed you that figure from, they actually debunk Fisher's corollary to his theorem when they figure out that one of the founding fathers, if you will, of population genetics and neo-Darwinism was Fisher, Dr. Fisher. I think it's R.A. Fisher is the full name. But in any case, it turns out that his prediction, if you will, for a fitness distribution was actually 50-50. And that's what he based his math on. 50% deleterious, 50% beneficial. So for Hancock to sit here with a straight face and claim that the preponderance of deleterious mutations is a prediction of evolutionary theory is, I think, just beyond ridiculous. Because it clearly is not the case. That is not what was predicted at all. But the reason that he's saying it's a prediction underscores another problem. Because what he's saying is that he says most populations in nature are relatively stable. They aren't growing or shrinking in size, but maintain a roughly constant long-term average population size. Now, what he's getting at there is that is how population geneticists define their quote-unquote absolute fitness. Now, when I gave a talk on genetic entropy, I used the term absolute fitness in a different way. What they're using, so to compare it, they define absolute fitness of 1, meaning that the population is neither growing or shrinking, so it's stable. Whereas I'm following like what Dr. John Sanford is arguing for, not only in his book but in his other works and his talk that he gave at the National Institutes of Health, where he's arguing for an actual objective measure of fitness that would be based on something physical and like, for example, running speed, breathing ability. You can list it out. There's just an infinite number of different parameters you could choose.
Paul, I like the analogy that you use, the illustration that you used.
Yeah.
I can't remember. It might have been in your debate with Dr. Ron Garrett, who is another PhD who's written against genetic entropy, but it had to do with age. And so let's say every single generation, my lifespan decreased by a couple of years.
Yes.
Well, if my lifespan, was 70, and then my progeny, their lifespan was decreased to 68, and then eventually 66, and so on and so forth. You can, even though your lifespan, your ability to live that long is decreasing, you can still have children. It has no effect on your ability to have a lot of children. But eventually you're going to reach a point where, yes, it does affect your ability to have children. So for a while, it can be linear, right? It can be just stable until your lifespan has decreased to a point, because it has been slightly deleterious and harmful, to where now there's reproductive fitness is
Yeah.
negatively affected.
Yeah, because reproductive age, the age for human beings of reproduction is heavily skewed toward the younger side of your life.
Right.
And the later years of your life are generally not reproductively active, right? So it would take quite a lot of degradation of lifespan before it started having any impact on population size.
But it would
And
make
this is
no sense to say that this mutation that is accumulating from generation to generation to decrease one's lifespan has no deleterious effects at all.
exactly.
That would
Yeah,
make no sense to say.
and this is why I keep talking about this, because the way that the population geneticists frame this concept of fitness is a very imperfect proxy.
Mm,
So on the one hand, we can't say that it's totally useless, because then we have no data to work on. But we're using their data out of their papers. So
right.
obviously their definition of fitness isn't totally useless, or we would have nothing to go on and we would have no argument to be made, because even Dr. John Sanford is quoting from the works of these population geneticists. So it's a straw man to try to claim that our argument has nothing to do with their definition of fitness. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge and understand that their definition of fitness has problems and it's incomplete. It's
Right.
an imperfect proxy, okay? Because they're only looking at population size, which is
Yeah.
why Hancock said, oh, well, we would predict it because population sizes are stable. Well,
Well,
there's a lot more to life than population size,
right.
first of all. Go ahead, and I think you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because I made a few notes based on what Zach Hancock was arguing with you in your open mic debate on this topic, which was excellent, and
Mhm.
also some of what he said in this video. And so I've noted, as you've pointed out, that reproductive success as a way to determine a population's fitness is not the best definition of fitness. Fitness should not be defined so narrowly as whether it affects reproductive fitness or not. And so, yes, effectively neutral mutations do not immediately affect reproductive fitness, which is why they are precisely called selectively neutral. So instead, they respond to what? Genetic drift. And so they
Yeah.
drift in the
Yeah.
population randomly, exhibiting their
Yeah.
deleterious effects. But if enough of, I'll say this, if enough of those effectively neutral mutations accumulate in the genome, then they will, as we've been saying, eventually affect reproductive fitness, because you eventually reach a point where the number of deleterious mutations that have accumulated have harmed the population to the extent where the genome has basically become incomprehensible, in the same way that you have a book that's experiencing all these typographical errors. Each typographical error on its own is inconsequential, but eventually that book becomes unreadable.
Yeah, and that's the point that they just want to keep dodging. They just want to play this word game. Oh, well, if it didn't affect reproductive fitness, then it didn't affect anything, right? That's the game they want to try to play. But I'm going to throw a wrench in their argument on a very it's kind of coming out of left field a little bit. But I just came across this paper. I remember reading it years ago, maybe even like when it was brand new, because this is from 2018 when I was still in apologetics professionally. But this is by Dr. Jerry Bergman, and I'm not going to like read through the article, but I just want to bring it to everybody's attention because it's so relevant here. um, the name of this article is The Self-Regulation of Growth Problem for Natural Selection. And I'll just read the abstract. The core of Darwinian theory is that more animals are born than a land area can typically support, producing competition for limited resources, including food and mates. As a result, competition will occur between the more fit and the less fit. In the end, the more fit will be more likely to survive and pass their genes on to their offspring. The result is the law popularly termed survival of the fittest, which is the main engine of evolution according to Darwinism. However, field research has documented that most mammals and other
Well,
animals as well.
I wanted to ask you, do you want me to share screen this article? Screen
Am
share
I
the
not
article?
sharing?
Okay, you are now. You're good, Paul.
Sorry, I didn't know how that was working. I thought I
That's
was sharing because I chose to share it.
no worries. You're good to go now. I can see it
Yeah,
on
yeah,
screen.
good. So the result is the law popularly termed survival of the fittest, which is the main engine of evolution according to Darwinism. However, field research has documented that most mammals and other animals as well self-regulate their population in such a way that largely negates the Darwinian survival of the fittest law and thus falsifies the main driver of evolution. And so I recommend people check out this paper at creation.com. It's unfortunately it's not in the HTML format yet. It hasn't been made into a web article, but the PDF document is available for free at creation.com. And it's Journal of Creation 32/1/2018 by Jerry Bergman, The Self-Regulation of Growth Problem. And the reason it's a problem is that Hancock's whole basically argument here is predicated on this assumption that it's a balance between mutational effects, positive and negative, that's actually holding the population stable. But what we know from actual true field research is that it's way, way more complicated than that. And that animal populations don't just reproduce out of control until mutations force their numbers back down. That's not how it works. They self-regulate. They live with their environment in a symbiotic way. They don't just run out of control like a virus does. Okay? That's what viruses do. They just reproduce out of control. But mammals and things like that, deer is one of the examples that they use. They found an example where deer, when they start to become actually too numerous in a given environment, it actually starts affecting them physiologically, and they can actually have a mass die-off just because they're overcrowded to their own, like emotionally overcrowded, right? Not overcrowded like, well, oh, there's no food. No, they actually get emotionally overcrowded, and it can actually cause a die-off. So the point being here is that mutations are not the sole responsible factor that keep populations at a quote unquote stable absolute fitness. You can think of this absolute fitness that they're talking about kind of like an acceleration rather than a speed, right? But what we need to look at is what is the genetic health? Like a population can be stable size-wise, but it can be declining in genetic health. And that's why this whole argument here is really like it's only a piece of the puzzle. Now, another thing I'm going to bring out is a very revealing statement, because the argument that Hancock is using is that, standard population genetics math shows that we reach a fitness equilibrium. But importantly, Hancock makes this statement. He says, any beneficial variant is promoted by selection and hence fixes in the population quite rapidly, but selection does not favor deleterious mutations. The only way they can go to fixation is via genetic drift, which is very slow. So we know intuitively that and he's using the math, U A to B must be greater than U B to A. And what he's saying there is, well, because of selection, we know that a smaller proportion of beneficial mutations can counterbalance a larger proportion of deleterious mutations. But the important thing to notice here is that the force that he's applying that makes this true is, in fact, natural selection. And Donnie, can you maybe figure out what the problem there is?
Yeah, I'm looking at the notes that we have based on what he's saying
Yeah,
here
the
at 2254.
the big problem there is that if you look at any realistic distribution of fitness effects, it's obvious, and Sanford states this in his book. So, I mean, basically, Hancock is just ignoring this or trying to dodge it. Most beneficial mutations are going to be effectively neutral,
Hmm.
right? How could it be any other way, right? Because
Right.
we already know that most mutations are effectively neutral. So how are we going to have this special pleading where on one side, most deleterious are effectively neutral, but then somehow by magic, if you look at the other side of the distribution, now it's suddenly not true that most beneficial mutations are effectively neutral? Of course it's true, because the reason for this is the princess and the nucleotide paradox, right? The reason is because you have a zone of no selection that cuts down the center of this distribution on both sides of the axis, not just one side. And the biological basis for that is the princess and the nucleotide paradox, the fact that you've got all these layers of complexity that separate the overall organism, which is what selection acts on, from any individual nucleotide change. So when you look at these individual, like these super mega beneficial mutations that you witness in certain experimental situations, you have to realize, first of all, what are they experimenting on? Generally, either viruses or bacteria, right?
Right.
And those have much, much simpler genomes, not in terms of size, not in terms of gigabytes, but in terms of information content, obviously. I mean, we know that must be the case because no one can deny that a human being is orders of magnitude more complex than a bacterium or a virus. So obviously, the genome, the functional information in the genome for either a bacteria or a virus is way less, way simpler than for a human being. So it's going to be easier to have selection be more powerful in that situation because you have fewer mattresses, so to speak, right?
Right.
On your to use the princess of the nucleotide, the simpler the genome is, the fewer mattresses you have. The more layers of complexity you add, the more mattresses you have between the princess and the pea.
Would it be like
So
comparing maybe a bicycle where there's really only a few parts associated with a bicycle, and let's say a high level automobile like a
yeah,
Camaro where you've got a ton of different parts and complexity associated
yeah.
with that? Yeah.
So if you look at a distribution of effects of making random changes to a bicycle, you know, and keeping in mind that what they're measuring is a relative fitness. So
Mhm.
again, it's speed of reproduction in a given environment is what they're
Right.
looking at. So you look at a bicycle, can you, in a given environment, if it turns out like if there's something on it that's helpful in some environments, but it's not helpful in all environments, and then you mutate it such that that thing that isn't really necessary in this particular environment, you break it or get rid of it, that can be beneficial because you've gotten rid of something you didn't need.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean like that type of thing is going to get reported in the literature as a beneficial mutation
Right.
because they're not making any distinction between when they're doing these distributions of fitness effects, they're not making any distinction between gain of function or loss of function because all they're measuring is speed of reproduction and does it decrease or does it increase. So they're not there's no way they know why the fitness actually increased, right? All they know is um, they broke something, they mutated something, and it started reproducing faster in that environment.
And
That's all they can say.
I think a prime example of this is Lenski's bacterial experiment. And so basically they define fitness as you're saying how fast the growth rate is
Yeah,
on these bacterial species. But the best way to speed up growth in these bacterial populations was to what? Eliminate genes. And so basically, these necessary genes within these bacterial, these E. coli, they were removed since those genes slow down the bacteria. And so now they can uh, grow faster. But it's in almost every case of Lenski's bacterial experiment, the genes were either deleted, broken, down regulated, or eliminated.
Yeah.
And so
And
it's akin to basically removing weight from your car to temporarily get better gas mileage. And so are you saying to the evolutionist, this is an increase in fitness, even though the bacteria are shrinking in functional genome sizes, they're losing pre-existing genes? To the evolutionist, this is an increase in fitness, right?
exactly. That's the
Yeah.
problem, is that they're
Yeah.
defining fitness in such a narrow way that it misses the forest for the trees in terms of
Mm.
genetic health or actual quote unquote evolution. Um, here's a paper that's relevant to this. Donnie, can you let my screen share real quickly here?
Yes.
So here's just one example. What we find when we look at how these beneficial mutations act collectively, a lot of times what they find is diminishing returns, or another way to phrase it is antagonistic epistasis. So antagonistic epistasis is a problem because what they're finding is that when you start putting these quote unquote beneficial mutations together, it turns out that their effect doesn't work additively together. It actually doesn't help. And what that implies is that these are reductive mutations rather than additive or building function. These beneficial mutations don't work well together because they're just breaking things, generally speaking. They're tending to break things that just weren't needed in that particular experimental environment. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yep.
And another thing that you'll find, I've seen evolutionists, I can't remember if it was Zach Hancock or somebody else, but they'll refer to antagonistic epistasis in deleterious.
Right.
And they'll claim, oh, well, you know, it's not so bad because when you add them together, there's a limit to how much damage they do. And that's quote unquote antagonistic epistasis. But if you read the papers that are talking about that, they're saying the reason for this is that you can only break something, to a certain level of brokenness, right? Like if the mutation keeps hitting the same broken spot, it's not going to get any worse because it was already broken. You can't break it again, right?
Right.
So that's antagonistic epistasis, but that doesn't help evolution. You can hit a car in the same spot with a hammer twice, but if you broke it the first time, then the second hammer swipe doesn't do any more damage. It was already broken.
Right. It's like beating a dead horse.
Beating a dead horse. Exactly. What's the point? It's already dead. So if
I'd like to,
mutations keep hitting the same broken spot, it's not going to break it anymore.
I'd like to point out something real quick. So 3 years ago, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, I hosted a debate between Dr. Kevin Anderson and Jackson Wheat. And Dr. Kevin Anderson discussed how in Lenski's experiment, and this is a relatively newer paper, the actual beneficial mutations, they are being lost. And this is right from the conventional literature, that basically they are not reaching fixation, they're being lost in the population. And so in real world experiments, this is what we see. I mean, beneficial mutations are rare. As you've pointed out, they're typically reductive and functionally compromising to organisms. They are typically lost due to genetic noise. And so selection never really amplifies them. But in the case of Lenski's experiment, those beneficial mutations that have been paramount in the population, they're actually now being lost. So if they don't reach fixation, then there's really no benefit to be had there. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. I mean, I think here's kind of an elephant in the room that's not being addressed by a lot of people. But, all of this population's genetics, math and models, they kind of talk about it as if they're really giving us this mathematical basis of evolution. But at the end of the day, since all they're talking about is population size, right? At the end of the day, that's all they're talking about. So even if everything they say is 100% correct, in the best case scenario, all they've done is explain to us how populations can either stay the same or increase in size. But if we go back to what this whole debate is really about, it's about Darwinian evolution, right? So Darwin, his whole theory was so groundbreaking because he claimed he was explaining the origin of species. He wasn't claiming on the origin of stable populations, right?
Right.
That wasn't what this whole thing was about, right? So, when these guys insist on this hyper narrow definition of fitness, they're shooting themselves in the foot because they're admitting that their best theories actually tell us nothing about evolution. They only tell us how populations are staying the same size or growing. But what we want to know is, Mr. Evolutionist, how do you get from a bacterium to a human being?
Right.
We don't care if the bacteria population is growing or not. That doesn't tell us anything. We want to know, how do you get from a bacteria to a human being?
Right.
And Zach
How does that
Hancock,
answer the question of ancestry?
how does it exactly? I'd like to know. Zach Hancock says that Sanford sees everything in this sort of antiquated ladder of progress, but this idea, and again, I'm quoting Hancock here, this idea is simply not part of evolutionary theory. There is no organism on the planet more advanced than any other, because advanced is not a biological concept, it's a social concept. All right. Let's think about that. Now he says, but we can talk about differences in complexity, which has interesting biological implications, but progress does not mean complexity and vice versa. So what is he doing here? He's kind of like giving us this giant hand wave of, don't worry about how you get from a bacteria to a human, because humans are really not more advanced than bacteria, according to Hancock.
Right.
So, okay, black is white, white is black, up is down, down is up. Yeah. Just say it, and that makes it true, right? But for those of us with eyes open and not with our heads in the sand, then yes, advanced is a biological concept. Yes, there is a quote-unquote ladder of progress. That's not antiquated. That's the whole game. That's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a ladder of progress from single-celled proto what are they called? Proto-cells, if you will, all the way up to a human being. If that's not a ladder of progress, I'm sorry, I don't know what is. And if your models can't even begin to give us a clue into that, which they can't, then just admit you don't know. Don't play this word game of, oh, well, there's no advanced.
It's semantics to say.
Give me a break on that,
right?
Zach. I mean, seriously, give me a break.
It really, it's semantics, and it's flabbergasting to say that going from a single-celled-like organism billions of years ago into a multi-celled organism, into a fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, and eventually man, something as sophisticated as a human being is not progress, is not going up a ladder. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
According to Hancock, it's not progress, and we're not more advanced. We're just lucky, that's all, I guess.
Yeah.
But if you look at it in terms of absolute fitness, we're actually unlucky, right? Yeah. Well, actually not absolute fitness, but what we'll call it population size. If that's the whole goal of evolution is population size, then the unicellular life are still the big winner. They're still more, they're still the ones that are most evolutionarily successful. But that's self-evidently ridiculous. And so, this is why you get this double speak of, when you corner them down, when you pin them down, then they start talking like, well, nothing is more advanced than anything else. Right. But then when you turn on, any other, when you listen to them in any other environment, when they're not having to defend evolution, then all of a sudden we're right back to talking about things being advanced and the ladder of progress and all of that. So
it's like saying a Chevy or a Dodge Challenger, there's one of these really nice cars, or a Chevy Camaro is no more sophisticated and complex than a bicycle, like we were talking about earlier, or one of those Hot Wheel cars. It's not intuitive. It doesn't really make any sense, Paul.
Yeah, Hancock says, here's at timestamp 5126. He says, Sanford's argument only works in a cartoonish world in
Yeah.
which all simplistic assumption of the genetic load model are met. I want to be clear that I'm not saying the genetic load model is not useful. It's a valuable model in conservation genetics, especially, but when population geneticists use it, we don't take it as gospel. We understand that it has a series of assumptions, so we coach our language in understanding those assumptions. Sanford gives you none of that. He wants you to take it at face value. So let me unpack what he's saying there. He's saying, you lay people, don't try to understand what we're saying. We'll tell you what it means. And we'll decide when it applies and when it doesn't apply. We'll decide when it's cartoonish to talk about our theories and when it's useful to talk about our theories. If you try to decide that, you non-population geneticist, you're bound to get it wrong. You just need to listen to us. We don't take our own theories as gospel. Well, what do they take as gospel? I'll tell you what they take as gospel. It's evolution. That's the gospel for them. That is what is not questioned. But any of these theories can be thrown away at the drop of a hat if it doesn't seem to be suiting them at the moment. That's how I take that. But what do you think, Donnie?
A lot, but briefly, I will. So, firstly, I'll share screen just for people to have an avenue to go to find many of Dr. Sanford's research publications on this issue. But I would argue, so he's saying that Sanford's argument and the argument we advance is cartoonish, but I would say that his argument and his model is highly contrived because he's focusing almost entirely on mathematical models, while Dr. John Sanford has pointed out, and I agree, that these numerical simulations are much more superior to these highly contrived mathematical models that Zach Hancock and other population geneticists focus on. One thing is on my mind because Zach Hancock, throughout his review, as you probably remember, he questioned Dr. Sanford's knowledge in population genetics. He would basically use rhetorical statements by saying, "Oh, Dr. Sanford, his arguments make it appear like he doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to population genetics." But Dr. Sanford has published numerous technical papers since advancing the genetic entropy thesis, Paul, and this abundance of technical work has been based on extremely technical population genetics research.
Yeah.
And so the critics need to read the technical papers associated with the book Genetic Entropy, which is written for more of a lay level audience to make the concept more understandable. But the types of formulas that Dr. Zach Hancock and those scientists in the field of population genetics focus so heavily on, again, is not sophisticated numerical simulations like Dr. John Sanford or Dr. John Baumgartner and Wes Brewer have invented. But these types of numerical simulations, Paul, these are what are necessary for forward-moving populations. And
Yeah.
your critics, they can't. Paul, go ahead.
No, you finish your statement and I'll break in.
Well, I was going to point out because I like to anticipate the critics, and they all scoff and criticize Mendel's accountant program. But the primary authors of the Mendel Code are Dr. John Baumgartner and Dr. Wes Brewer, and they are world-class experts in numerical simulations. And yes, many of these technical articles have been published in non-conventional journals, but many have also been published in conventional journals. And I haven't seen any of these evolutionist critics publish any worthwhile responses in any specific journals.
I mean,
And
like
so I think
most
it's just hand waving it away. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, like most evolutionists, Hancock is very good at speaking out of both sides of his mouth. So on the one hand, he's bashing John Sanford for looking at these models and seeing what they show, but then he calls that cartoonish. He says it's
Right.
cartoonish to use that to look at this stuff and think it's actually accurate. But then if that at the same time, if you go previously in his video, he uses that very model. If you jump back to the 23 minute mark, he's using this very math that he just at the end called cartoonish.
Right.
But now he's using this math that doesn't even seem to take neutral theory into consideration at all, because he says any beneficial variant is promoted by selection. We know that's not true. This is cartoonish.
It's false.
So if what John Sanford did is cartoonish, this is cartoonish to the extreme. It's cartoonish squared, because he's using this inaccurate model to then try to claim that this refutes what we, first of all, intuitively know to be true. Because at the end of the day, we don't have to do all of these experiments to know what everybody with a brain knows. It's easier to break a machine than it is to improve on it, right?
Right.
Anybody knows that. Any child knows that. This is why we go to school to become engineers, right? This is why you don't go out to a battleship and start hitting on it with hammers and throwing things at it, and eventually it turns into a spaceship, right? Because that's just, it's obvious that's not how it works.
It's logical. It's intuitive. Yeah.
So it takes so much of this double speak and rhetoric and confusing cartoonish math to convince what would otherwise be intelligent, educated people to just ignore what they know is obviously true.
That's why your evolutionists, I've found, maybe you found the same thing, they don't like illustrations and analogies because they make too much sense.
Yeah.
They are intuitive, like introducing typographical errors into a text. Over time, that's not going to make the text more readable. Or introducing rust molecules onto a car. Over time, that car is not going to get any better, even if you take it to regular oil changes, change your tires, change the windshield wipers. It doesn't matter. Sure, that might increase the longevity of the car, but it's not going to stop the car from decaying due to rust over time. And it's very intuitive.
When it comes to these debates, the evolutionists hate these analogies because the analogies take away their power to deceive. Yes. The analogies show the truth for what it clearly is, and it makes it so obvious that it's hard to deny, but they specialize in making these subtle arguments that depend upon fake math and dishonest use of words to kind of muddy what would otherwise be a very clear picture.
It's a very clear picture, and I want to say this, but they invoke these highly contrived mathematical models that the majority of the population can't understand and have to basically blindly assume that the population geneticist is correct. I would say their model is cartoonish, and Dr. John Sanford's model is reality.
It's approaching reality much more so than the cartoonish models that the old style, population genetics that doesn't really take the reality of mutations and the reality of the fact ultimately that what we're talking about here is information. That's the other thing that they don't like to talk about, is that the genome is information. It's not a pile of nucleotides. That is not our genome. Our genome is not the biochemical mass of the DNA molecule. The genome is the information that molecule codes for. And the fact that we've discovered DNA and we've discovered that information is the basis of life is a death blow to Darwinian evolution at its core. So, I mean, ultimately, we could talk forever.
Follow-up question, Paul. Well, what's your definition? Of information? How can we determine what is and what isn't?
That's the type of game that they play. It's obvious what information is, but not all things that are obvious are necessarily easy to define. And species is another clear example of this. It's hard to define exactly what is a species, but we intuitively understand that there are these, discrete groupings of animals that we use the word species for, even if it's not always easy to put it into words or define it. And there are lots of things like that, things that are obvious and yet hard to define. But they want to pounce on the fact that it's hard to define in order to try to deny what is obvious.
Right.
So I I think people, more educated than me and more, expert level than I am, I hope to see some of that in the future poke even more holes in what Hancock has said. But I think what we're producing here tonight, Donnie, is at least just a good starting point for people to look at how Hancock is being deceptive, and he's painting a false picture of both John Sanford as a person, because he's extremely well qualified and extremely knowledgeable in genetics.
Right.
Hancock would have us believe that he's a doofus who can't, give us a clear understanding of anything in genetics, basically.
I challenge the critics and the audience to take a deep dive into Dr. Sanford's published literature. Even those on our own side, take a deep dive into the technical articles and papers that they've published using Mendel's accountant. Mendel's accountant is user specific. Okay, you can input whatever settings you want, realistic or unrealistic. You can literally take any mutation rate you want, any mutation distribution, population size that Dr. Zach Hancock likes to talk about. All of these parameters you can apply to these artificial populations. And when you allow it to run its course, we look to natural selection and we find over and over again that with any realistic set of parameters, evolution doesn't work and genetic degeneration is inevitable. And Paul, they've published technical articles looking at synergistic epistasis, looking at mutation count mechanisms, truncation selection, trade-offs, junk DNA. They've all been looked at, analyzed, and published. And I find that the critics just want to hand wave it away. And it's a shame.
Yeah. I think everybody needs to read John Sanford's book. And if you feel like you're ready to take the next step, don't think badly of the book because it's written at a layperson's level. Be glad that he gave us a good starting point at a layperson's understanding level,
Right.
and then go deeper. Read, like Donnie, you said, go to geneticentropy.org. Look at Sanford's published academic technical work if you want to get into some more technical stuff. But don't take cheap shots and bash a lay level book for being a lay level book. That's ridiculous. So, Donnie, I think those are my opening thoughts here. I think we can talk more on this in the future as things develop. But do you have any other thoughts you'd like to add before we wrap up here? We're just about getting to the hour mark here. So, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think you did an excellent job. I think this was a fantastic preliminary response. I strongly believe, as my audience knows, that it's important that we engage the critics, that we address the critics, and that is what we're doing here. I look forward to a follow-up, something in the future. Chris Roop and I were working a lot behind the scenes on fixation equilibrium and how that presents an even larger problem for the evolutionists. And I currently don't see Zach Hancock and other PhDs like Dan Stern Cardinal addressing that issue. And so, yeah, I think I'll just wrap it up there and save any additional points for future videos. Paul, you really are a warrior for Christ, brother. It is a blessing. I am so glad that you have entered the debate scene, because you're doing a great job on this topic. You just had a discussion with Dan Stern Cardinal maybe a week ago, and I thought you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing how this ongoing debate progresses.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Donnie.
My pleasure, Paul, and we'll wrap it up there. God bless you. To the audience, please share this around. The truth is important. We want people to know that we are responding to the critics. We're engaging their arguments. So share this around on YouTube, share this around to your friends, your family, share it around on Facebook. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. God bless all.